Okay, welcome. Thank you for coming along. So this is the 5th of our Leveraging Green organising workshops. The title this time, or our kind of theme, is Agitating for Climate Action, Organising, Educating and Change. So this is about green organising, as they all have been. It's creating that momentum towards positive environmental and ecological change from within a workplace, and preferably with workers driving that process. But it's also about mobilising workers' perspectives and interests in strategising on how a workplace can become sustainable. And then sustainability in itself, it's important to remember that that's quite a broad definition. You know, there's ecological sustainability, social sustainability, economic sustainability. So it's all of these things all kind of all brought together and all overlapping. And like many aspects of the broader trade union organising, a vital part of green organising is agitating, right? So we're in the business of actively creating concern or thought about this topic of sustainability and climate change, and in order to incentivize and lead those who need to be led towards taking positive action. So it's about sort of riling people up in order to create change. And obviously there's lots of ways that we can do that, lots of ways that we can be agitating. So today we're going to hear from some trade unionists with experience of doing precisely that. Their experiences and approaches, as you'll hear today, are quite different. They vary, but they also overlap. And this is a key aspect of what I think successful green organising looks like. There's no right way to be a green rep or a trade unionist engaged in green activity in a workplace, or in fact outside of a workplace. It's about a sort of diversity of approaches suitable to each particular set of circumstances. In each workplace, you're better off, in some workplaces rather, you'll be better off building personal relationships with management to get change happening. In others, management aren't listening, right? So you're better building a public campaign to pressure them or even shame them into action, perhaps. Elsewhere, you're building, you're better building worker consciousness and a kind of general level to enable that mass action that workers can assert themselves to create change. So in some situations this is about actions, and others it's about words, and this is all bound up with the idea of education, I think, which is one of the subtitles of our talk or our session today. And I think the reason for that is that agitation and education go hand in hand. They're sort of overlapping concepts, right? So education, what's that about? Well, that's telling people facts, opinions, ideas that they didn't previously know, or guiding them towards those facts or new interpretations of facts, perhaps things they already did know, but interpreting that in a different way. And if we break that down further, there's different types of useful education in the kind of climate sphere, the net zero sphere as well. There's political education about explaining how and why socioeconomic processes take place and identifying where power lies and where oppression lies and different forms of oppression and power. But there's also sustainability education about what is effective action that results in decarbonisation or better jobs or whatever else, or better lower emissions. And then there's also organising education about explaining the best ways to affect change by working class action, by trade union action. And it's these forms of education and agitation and how they overlap that we'll be exploring this afternoon, hopefully. We've got a couple of hours. We will finish by 2. And we've got 3 named speakers. It would be great if we have a more open conversation. It doesn't want to just be these 3 and me rambling on. It would be better if it was a full thing, which we'll get into later. But the 3 named speakers we've got are Jo Rees. She's a policy officer in Trade Union Education Wales for Trade Union Congress in Wales, TUC Cymru. She's got a wealth of experience in green education. I think she's going to introduce herself in a bit more detail than this, but wealth of experience in green education and green networks and green trade unionism and training and things like this all over the country. We've also got Daphne Robins, who's a Unite rep from Hull City Council, nearer to us. She's the principal union learning rep for the council. In fact, she won TUC Uni Learning Rep of the Year a few years back. I recently learned. And she's an environmental rep, importantly, for the council as well. And she built a little team of environmental reps, which is brilliant to see. And we've also got Eve Merrall, who's a UCL Green rep, who's played who currently still plays a key role in the Liverpool Green Claim that many of you will be familiar with, and has recently revamped our TUC Green Rep course as well, for which I'm very thankful. So we'll hear from each of them for a little bit, 50 minutes or so, and then we'll take a break for coffees and to look away from the screen. We're supposed to be looking away, aren't we? Stretch our legs. And we'll also, and then after that, we'll come back and we'll have a sort of full discussion about their contributions, but also your own experiences. It'll be really good to bring in as many different sets of experiences and limitations, problems, solutions that we can muster about this topic. So I'll just say the way we'll do this is hold your questions and comments until the second half of this session. Do write them down, do make a note of them, because things will pop into your head as the speakers are speaking, but try and hold them until we get onto it later. And I'll just underline, we do have 3 people who are approaching this in different ways, and the members of the broader audience will be approaching this in different ways. The idea of putting them next to each other is not so you can pick a favorite. It's not that one of these is right and you have to try and find out which one it is. It's to kind of showcase this diversity of opinions and diversity of approaches that I was talking about earlier. There is no right way to be a green rep, in the same way it's no right way to do any trade unionism. It's just about what works. Yeah, we're not picking favorites. We're just kind of comparing. And it may be that some of what someone says you think, well, that sounds great, but I have no way of putting that into place in my workplace. That's fine, because for others it may well be the opposite way around. But anyway, so we'll crack straight on. What time are we now? Almost 15:15. So we'll go to we'll hear from them in the order I introduced them. So we'll go straight over to Joe. If you want to, tell us about green agitating from your perspective.
Well, good afternoon, Bryn Howenda, as they say in Wales, everybody, and thank you, Sam. Thanks for that introduction, and yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to come along and share with you a bit about some of the work that we've done on this within Wales TUC or TUC Cymru. Yes, Sam's invited me here today and asked me to talk to you a bit about some of the challenges and successes that we've had in Wales on the theme of green organising and educating for climate and environmental action. So just to explain, I previously worked on the climate and just transition policy in TUC Cymru, but now I'm working in a different role as the education officer here. So you might notice a bit of a shift in focus as I talk through this, sort of from the policy more to the educating part of the equation as I go through. So I'm a little bit out of date now on some of the policy side of things because I haven't really worked on that for sort of 18 months or so. But I thought I'd still give a bit of background on both elements here, just to explain kind of how we developed this work in Wales and share what's worked for us and perhaps some lessons learned from some of the challenges as well. Just going back to where it kind of started. So back in 2020, the kind of pre-COVID era, there were all the climate emergency declarations, and the issue was really rising up the agenda with trade unions as well. And we were conscious here in TUC Cymru that environment and action to tackle carbon emissions was a devolved issue to Welsh Government, but we didn't actually have a kind of formal overarching climate emergency or just transition policy within Wales TUC. So we then worked with our affiliate unions to develop a new policy, and that campaign was signed off by our General Council in June 2020. And so it was published in a report called A Green Recovery and a Just Transition. And that was all kind of based around a 5-point plan. So I'll just run through the kind of key elements of that just to explain kind of how we focus this. So firstly, we were calling for a clear and funded pathway to a greener economy in Wales. Secondly, we called for workers to have a central voice through trade unions. And in Wales, we have kind of social partnership arrangements, which have now been formalised in law here. So we were really pushing that just transition should be a part of social dialogue through those social partnership structures. Thirdly, we said that Welsh Government should use all their available levers to promote fair work to ensure that new jobs are good jobs. So we were talking about things like conditions on grant funding and procurement and things like that. Fourth, we said that employers should be putting workers at the heart of their transition plans. And we made specific reference to the important role of green reps within that as well. And then finally, we said that every worker should have access to funded training to improve their green skills. So those were the kind of 5 areas where we focused our work. And so in terms of what we did, we had a kind of dual approach to trying to achieve those aims. So on the one hand, we looked at the kind of the policy action and the strategic national focus, looking at the policy and structural improvements that we wanted to see within Wales. And then on the other hand, we looked at what we could do around educating and organising in the workplace, what support we could provide for reps and green reps at that kind of grassroots level to build from there. So how we went about this, so some of these things are quite obvious, but we did typical campaigning things like videos, events, blogs, roundtables. It was then coming up to kind of COP26, and we got involved in a lot of the campaigns around that. And our General Secretary, Shavana Taj, was part of the union delegation and represented Welsh trade unions there. We ensured there was union officer representation onto all the key Welsh Government kind of climate and net zero groups that existed at that time. There were kind of several different disparate groups. So we got the union representation in place there. And we supported those officers, and we set up a steering group of kind of key union officers. And then on the kind of educating side, we produced a toolkit and some new courses. So a new course for green reps and a course around negotiating for just transition aimed at officers. We trained up our tutors, and we published case studies showing the work of green reps in various different workplaces. We also set up a Greener Workplaces network, so with kind of quarterly online meetings on different topics and themes. And the aim of that was to provide kind of ongoing support and opportunities for reps to share with each other what they were doing in their own workplaces. We tried to focus on what we thought was achievable within Wales under the devolved settlement, and to use that kind of the existing or the planned legislation that we had in Wales. So you may be aware we have a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is kind of embedding the sustainable development principle into the decision making of public bodies, devolved public bodies in Wales. So we were sort of focusing on that. And then more recently, we've had the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Act, which is quite difficult to say. But that has obviously put the social partnership arrangements on bringing together government, employers, and unions on a legal footing, and that's also modified that Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So it means that when they're setting their kind of sustainable development goals within public bodies, they have to work with unions on those closely. So yeah, so we tried to look at what we could do within those kind of existing bits of legislation that we had and other policy levers, and obviously we've been working in the context of a supportive government, and then the other thing we focused on was to ensure that green skills was written into all of our Wales Union Learning Fund or WOLF projects that we support. So that was a really important element of the work too. So that was 5 years ago, and we're now 5 years on. So where are we now? So I've sort of made a list of some of the positive kind of outcomes that happened from that. So I think firstly, we secured a commitment of support for green reps from Welsh Labour in their 2021 manifesto. And then later that went into the subsequent programme for government from the Welsh Labour government. So that was good to have that kind of specific support written in there. We also achieved a clearer definition of and commitment to just transition and recognition of the role of trade unions and green reps within the Welsh Government's net zero plan, which is like their carbon budget 2. And that was a big improvement compared to the carbon budget 1. We got that commitment to funding for training and support for green reps from Welsh Government via TUC Cymru. So that's paid for resources, courses for reps, running the network, and it's now also funding a new dedicated staff member that we have in place on just transition and green skills. So that's been really positive. In the beginning, we worked really closely with Graham Peterson, who's a former trade union studies tutor. Many of you may know him from the Greener Jobs Alliance. He was also an officer in UCU, and he helped us to develop a toolkit and some specific training. And then we also ran a kind of train the trainer session for some of our own tutors in Wales. And so we've established kind of specialised lead green tutors within Wales. And now some of those tutors have gone on to help innovate and develop new courses and integrate elements of this agenda into the other courses that we deliver. So kind of mainstreaming some of it into our reps and health and safety reps and ULR training. In terms of the kind of green skills for the wider workforce, the Welsh Government did expand access to something that we have in Wales called personal learning accounts. I think there may be something similar in England, but it's basically like a personal kind of fund for a specific list of courses. And so they opened up that funding for environmental courses and expanded it so there was no kind of income cap. And that was something that we'd called for in our report. So that was really positive to see. So it's meant that loads of workers in Wales have been able to access like fully funded IEMA and NEBOSH courses on environmental management. So that's another positive. And the other thing I think that's been great is that all of our Wales Union Learning Fund projects, where they had the green skills written into their projects, that's led to like lots of things developing kind of spontaneously. There's some sector specific courses that have come up for members and workers. For example, I noticed in a couple of weeks, the National Union of Journalists Cymru Wolf Project is running a greenwash in comms course for their members. And there's been a lot of promoting of kind of carbon literacy and other environmental awareness. Unison have run a climate adaptation course for their members, I believe, and there's also been a lot of work to support and develop the role of green reps within some of the unions who've got projects. So, for example, the POA, FBU and community have written in that support for developing the green rep role in their projects. So those are some of the positives. And just quickly then on some of the challenges that we've had. I think for us, the funding settlement for Wales is very limiting in terms of the government's ability to plan ahead and having sufficient resources to support some of the ambitions that were in that Net Zero Wales plan and in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Economic development is devolved, but industrial strategy is not. So there's not much power to alleviate some of the impact that we've seen on high carbon sectors, where that UK government support is needed. And also, obviously, employment rights not being devolved. So facility time for green reps is still a huge issue. And despite warm words and the social partnership arrangements that we have, it's still very difficult to get traction and support for this with the employer's side in some cases. And then obviously, I think we'll all be aware of the competing priorities for unions and the demands on our reps and the branches in terms of cost of living, industrial action. In Wales, the new legislation we've had and kind of preparing for that and training reps on that. Issues like AI that have really come up the agenda and people are very concerned about. And these are all, very important things. And so I think perhaps people feel they've already got a lot on their plate, and sometimes we've seen kind of climate slip down the agenda a bit. The other thing that we found has been a barrier is sometimes the language and terminology. So, for example, a lot of people don't understand net zero, or it kind of has a negative connotation for them, I think, because it has the word zero in it. And the same just transition often misunderstood or perhaps has been misused. And a lot of the language around the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that we have here is kind of a bit of a barrier sometimes as well. And obviously it's this is the established language of kind of government or trade union policy, so we have to use it, but it often requires quite a bit of unpacking. And then we're also finding, as I think, I'm sure others have, there seems to be more of this kind of greenwash and a bit of backlash, misinformation, and obviously, where there are unjust transitions and people losing kind of faith there as well. Another problem that we have is that we still don't have a formal dedicated national centre for just transition discussions in Wales, either within or outside of social partnership. We don't have that, and we have also struggled to reach reps in the private sector, and obviously facility time there is often even more challenging for green reps. I just wanted to go back quickly to mention a bit more about some of the training now that we've developed for reps here. So one of the tutors I mentioned that is one of our lead green tutors, he actually has developed, he kind of identified a need for a half-day introduction course, kind of as an introduction to environmental awareness. And that's available in a version for reps or for members. It's kind of through workplace learning through the Wolf projects. And that's awareness raising, but it's also acts as a stepping stone to the green reps courses. So it looks at the climate emergency, but also wider environmental issues like resource use and pollution. It looks at actions that can be done as individuals, but it's very much focused on the need for a collective response, and it explains what's meant by a just transition and the role of the green rep. And then we have our Greening Our Workplaces, our 3-day Green Reps training course. That's kind of focused on understanding the climate and environmental emergency, identifying the impact on your workplace, working with the branch and members to identify environmental issues to raise with management, carrying out audits, looking at workplace agreements and developing those, awareness raising and promotion of green workplace practices. Then we had a third course, which was more focused on senior reps and negotiators, called Negotiating for a Just Transition. And that looks at the wider impact of the transition on issues like workplace skills, jobs and health and safety, looking at those kind of national and regional climate policies and sectoral policies, and how to obtain members' views on priorities for negotiating strategies. But as I mentioned as well, we've also incorporated this topic as a key theme into our core training for reps, health and safety reps and union learning reps as well. And we're kind of trying to review and adapt as we go along. And we're looking at incorporating more of the just translation training elements into our green reps and other reps courses, and offering some more targeted workshops for officers on just transition in the future. And we're also working to support our Union Learning Fund projects with their green skills commitments and to embed that green rep role more in the union branches. So yeah, just quickly, I've talked a long time, so I'm just going to try and finish up now. But just a few final reflections and a bit more on our future plans. I think with that introduction to environmental awareness course that I mentioned, I really wish that's something we'd done sooner, because it's been really helpful in getting more reps interested in becoming green reps, and we've had a lot of interest in that course. So I think that's been really useful. I don't know if others have noticed this, but I think it's definitely been noticeable that sometimes focusing on different dimensions of the environmental crisis, like protecting nature or reducing waste and pollution, has seemed to attract wider support compared to if just focusing on kind of carbon emissions or climate justice. So we're trying to frame things that way in our training as well. We're running our courses regularly. We still have quite modest numbers, but it's growing slowly but surely kind of thing. And we're building up that network of green reps and setting up more kind of crossover events with health and safety reps and ULRs as well. As I mentioned, we've now got a dedicated organising and developing officer who's taking forward our policy and campaigns work on green skills and just transition. And he's restarting our green network shortly, which is great news. I think long term, we've got more potential for trade union influence and worker voice to be heard on this issue within the devolved public sector as those social partnership arrangements develop and mature. Um, um, yeah, I would say we've been in a really fortunate position with the funding and support we've received over the last 5 years, but we've still found it really challenging and definitely a slow burner in terms of building up the number of green reps and getting worker voice heard on this issue. And we don't know what the future holds here with the Senedd elections coming up in just over a year, so could find ourselves in a different position potentially. But it's really heartening to see the difference being made in workplaces by the reps out there, and we've got some fantastic case studies on our website if you wanted to have a look. So yeah, we're really keen to work closely with others across the movement to learn from the work that's happening elsewhere and how we can work together to build the network of green reps and support union-led, worker-led action to ensure this issue has the attention it needs. So I'm going to finish there, but very happy to take any questions. I'm looking forward to hearing from others on the call today about what's happening elsewhere. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'll just stop spotlighting you. That's great. That was a really helpful overview of what you're doing. It's nice to hear it. I mean, I know a lot of this already, but for me, it's nice to hear it in a list, to be honest, how you're getting on. And it re-inspires me we should be doing so much of this stuff in other locations in the UK as well. I'm sure people will have questions or comments or thoughts, but we'll hear from the other two speakers and then come back and kind of open that up, because there'll be crossover anyway. But thank you very much. That's great, Joe. I think we had, who are we doing next? Daphne. Daphne Robins, we'll go over to you.
Thank you, Sam, for convening this workshop and enabling us to be here today, and hopefully to share some great ideas and learn from each other. So, hello everyone. My name's Daphne Robins. I'm going to talk about my journey as an environmental rep within a public sector organisation, and look at how we've organised our reps, training, and the wider environmental education. So I work in the Economic Development and Regeneration Department at Hull City Council. I will say at the beginning that I'm not going to be talking about politics in this session, because I am under the pre-election guidance rules. So if there are any political questions, I will not be able to answer those. So that out the way, we have about 5,000 staff in the council, and we deliver a huge number of traditional council services across a fairly dispersed geographical area, but we have quite a small city. It's 7 miles from east to west and north to south, and we have a very highly dense population with high levels of multiple deprivation. I come from a geoscience background, having studied environmental science at undergrad, and I've done a number of different environmental education courses since then, including with the TUC. And for many years, my work has involved technical consultancy and appraisal of capital and revenue projects under the EU programs. And these were aimed at supporting economic, social, and environmental initiatives in these areas of multiple deprivation. The projects involved cross-cutting themes that included environmental sustainability. They were required to meet these standards, or ideally exceed them and set new standards. So there was always a focus on, what does this project do for the environment? How does it not harm the environment, but how does it do something positive? So I joined Unite soon after it was formed, and was elected as a learning rep back in 2015. It seems like forever ago, but time flies when you're having fun. So this role involved conversations with colleagues across the organisation in relation to their further education aspirations, and it enabled me to explore wider themes that staff might be interested in, such as the environment. About 6 years ago, I was elected an environment rep and also an equality rep. So I now had 3 roles to try and cover. Being the only one in the organisation to do my job, and it being a busy role, I realised I needed to build a team of environmental reps to deliver any kind of programme that would work. So these people, I felt, would need to be able to work on activity legitimately. The activity needed to link with organisational targets and policies, and they needed to be able to carry out this role without it interfering with their day job, but also whilst they didn't have statutory rights to facility time for environmental work. So that's quite a difficult one. Anyway, not being daunted by that, I identified and recruited 2 other environment reps about 3 years ago. And after I attended a worker-led transition course for green reps that the TUC organised, I found this was a good opportunity to meet other environment reps from across the North East Yorkshire and Humber region, and across a number of unions. This gave me a whole fresh perspective on how to organise within sort of green education, and how to talk to people about environmental matters on different topics. It also spurred me on to ask my union to put on a course to train others. What I didn't mention to you at the beginning was I'm also a union tutor. So through that, I agreed to teach a 5-day online course with the 2 environmental reps from my workplace, as well as reps from other workplaces in other sectors. They found it extremely beneficial because it gave some of them an introduction to the work of a trade union rep, but from an environment perspective. They were set a task of designing an environmental project, which they had to present on the last day of the course. And this would be a program that was delivered in their workplace, ideally using existing resources and not know-how. And it was aimed at upskilling workers' understanding of environmental matters, whatever that might look like in their workplace. They also had to detail any action that could be taken through this program. So following the training, my colleagues and I worked to identify key contacts and build relationships with teams across the council, each of whom already undertake environmental work. So what we did there was we linked with people who were already doing things. So that legitimized what we were doing because it supported other workers in the workplace. So we talked to people in the climate change team, fleet management, so those who are looking at electrification of our fleet vehicles. We talked to waste management and recycling colleagues, those in flood risk, those in wildlife management, and a whole variety of others. We created a series of activities from that, and we publicized this through a staff newsletter, and we aligned these with the COP that was taking place last year. And we started off with a webinar. The first webinar, we had about 12 people attending, and we had speakers, including the climate change specialist, university flood specialist, and we also had Sam as a specialist green bargaining officer. So we tried to look at this in the round and bring not only the science but also the trade union aspect of green information, green understanding. A week later, we held a face-to-face marketplace style, sort of a marketplace event with little stalls. We had representatives from the teams I've just mentioned, and we had nearly 40 people attend that. So this, remember, it was the very beginning of our journey within that conversation between the environment reps and the wider staff. So we felt that was actually really positive. We had people visit the event right from the top of the organisation, both within the officer levels and within the political levels. And we had visits from across the political spectrum. I'll say that for balance. It's true, and we had we had a lot of positive support from everybody who attended. We surveyed our visitors to find out what they'd like to know more about. We used a little pop-up washing line, and we got some coloured cards, and we got pegs, and we got people to write their ideas on those and then hang them up on the washing line. We made it very clear that the union was the anchor to both of these events, and through our publicity, we made it very clear that the Unite Enviro reps were leading on the initiatives. This in itself was groundbreaking because suddenly we were able to function officially and carry out mainstream activity because we'd worked hard to develop those internal relationships with officers who were doing their day jobs. It very much helped to smooth that divide, that difference between doing an officer job and doing a rep job where you don't have statutory rights to facility time, to paid release. So we were able to broach that and cross that divide without anybody having any problem about that. So we were really grateful that the organisation supported us with that, and we worked hard as well to kind of convince people that it was the right thing to do. We ensured that we got buy-in from the highest levels and leadership within the organisation. This meant that these senior people helped to raise our profile. So they did some of the hard work for us. They got the message out, and we were able to do more because we had this permission. Now, we've agreed that we deliver a webinar every quarter, and we've also signed up to producing an annual face-to-face conference. So our next webinar is likely to be, 22nd of April. It happens to be Earth Day. We've identified some key dates across the organisation, across the year. such as World Environment Day on the 5th of June. And we've tried to tie our activity to those particular events, looking at different themes that we could reasonably run a webinar on. And by linking with those specific dates, it also raises the profile of that particular theme. So it gives meaning to those dates, it gives validity to what we're presenting on. And also it means that even though as union reps, we don't have rights, but we are working on something that is real, it's live, it's happening. So we've tried to maintain the links with the key dates across the year. So you might find that for some of, depending on which sector you work in, which organization you work for, you may have the same level of trust and autonomy, and others might not. My message here would be, look for those little wins and build on them and keep building, because you can achieve more than you realize. I didn't think we'd be able to achieve what we have got to so far in a fairly short space of time from when those other reps were trained. What I do is I always ask, is this the right thing to do? Does this fit with members' interests? Does it align with corporate priorities? Does it benefit external customers if our staff are better informed? And when those things line up, my role allows me a little bit more rope to undertake this work. But I also use the environment of the union to support this, because ultimately this benefits our members. I see climate change as an equity issue. All right. I think because it affects each and every one of us, and it affects us in different ways, we also all have a different ability and agency to respond to climate impacts. And this starts with education and information. So I see my role as an environment rep as raising awareness, sharing knowledge, connecting people, and that allows others to be empowered and better equipped. I don't know everything, but I try and learn as much as I can. I've done my carbon literacy accreditation. I've found little level 2 courses here, there, and everywhere. Just work through them, get some quals, or just learn the knowledge. It's all beneficial because it helps have those conversations with colleagues. In our branch, we've established an environmental officer position, and this will help raise awareness amongst our reps. So we've got a branch of 22 reps, and they cover lots of different areas across the council. So the intention is to keep this theme visible, and we want to build understanding amongst reps. Because they cover lots of service areas, they can identify members and they can identify issues through this theme. So if I can bring people together who can help each other, then we start to build capacity and work towards collective action. I'm going to close with just these 2 thoughts. What would your plan be for your workplace? And how can you and your colleagues mobilize your members to use your collective power and make positive change for each other and the workplace to reduce environmental impact? I'll leave you those 2 questions and say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daphne. That's great to hear. Those are entirely the right questions, good prompt questions, which we'll get to in the later on. We'll go straight to Eve now, who I can see has popped up. Yeah, over to you for a bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi everyone. My name's Eve. I'm currently studying for a PhD in marine ecology at the University of Liverpool. And so recently I was the UCU Green Rep for my branch as well. I've got exactly 30 days left to finish my PhD, so apologies if my contribution is a little bit more chaotic. My brain is feeling a little bit stretched at the moment. So Sam has asked me to talk about my experiences organising for climate action at Liverpool and to try and bring a bit more of a personal perspective into it rather than just trying to upsell the project, which is what I normally do. So I've taken that as an invitation for some critical analysis and some angst. So I hope that's what he meant. I came into the union as an environmentalist who wanted to take climate action, and I saw an opportunity in the Green New Deal claim in the union. I care deeply about nature and about people as a part of that, and I completely believe that the exploitation of the living world and the exploitation of people are intrinsically linked through the mechanism of profit and capitalism, which I think is made by the extraction of surplus from human and environmental labour. Just put that on the table. I feel like I'm constantly looking for the most effective way that I can make change, as Daphne and Jo both said. And I think I'm an ecological scientist, I've been a student campaigner, I've been an XR activist participating in direct action for climate, and a union rep, obviously. And most recently, I've worked with Sam on developing a new Green Reps course that tries to equip union reps to take action for a just transition within their workplaces. And I found that completely inspiring because I think that it perfectly illustrates that need for an ecology of movements, that there is no one effective way to take action, that we have to try them all and see what sticks, and that requires creativity and unlikely collaborations. I think, as Daphne mentioned, it can be a strange and challenging thing to be a green representative when you're the only one in your organisation, or when you kind of have that isolation and with or without the support of a union. And I think that this course felt like bringing together a room full of very different people who had the capacity to be kind of almost a union of their own, in the sense of creating a support network around a shared interest. So yeah, my politics has morphed and changed throughout these experiences, and I have generally tended towards a more anarchic model of thinking when it comes to organising. I think that we're more effective at the level of grassroots organising within our communities than we are by leveraging top-down mechanisms of change. And that has played out in my experiences of union politics, because I think in my branch in general, there's often a feeling that we're constantly at odds with the central bureaucracy that refuses to be radical, that makes decisions that don't feel like they benefit us or help our branch, and that we don't really have a choice in. So I've been more interested in kind of rank and file organising, and I haven't always been convinced that the union is the best mechanism for organising at all. But someone told me that there's no one right way to be a union activist, so here I am. And I think climate change presents a challenge to those localised ways of organising and thinking, because it isn't local, and that's exactly, as Daphne was saying, it's something that affects all workers regardless of locality, and so that makes it feel like the response also has to be global. And I think that that's really challenging to do effectively and justly from a worker standpoint, taking everyone with you. I think some of you will probably be familiar with the Liverpool Green New Deal claim. It was a green bargaining claim that was written a few years ago at Liverpool University, and it laid out a kind of holistic list of recommendations and demands that we wanted the university to take forward in 5 key areas. And those areas were reducing emissions on a local and global scale. They were advancing sustainable employment in the institution, decarbonising and decolonising our curriculum, promoting ethical research, and divesting from fossil fuels. And that claim was written primarily at the time by Ben Crawford, who was a PhD student at the time studying environmental action and labour law. And it was based on a proposed mechanism for environmental change that was put forward by UCU National and SOS UK. And it's about trying to use our collective bargaining power as unions to further climate action and just transitions for universities. So yeah, the ways in which universities might need a just transition aren't necessarily as obvious as some of the more industrial and production-based workplaces. Obviously, we're talking about education in this meeting anyway, but universities are also anchor institutions, and they employ people across a really wide range of disciplines. So that obviously includes academics and professional services staff, but it also includes technicians and caterers, estates management, in some cases there's health and social care. Some universities have on-site energy generation, of course all the outsourced production that they're also responsible for in areas like construction, waste disposal, cleaning. But in the language of management, they're also producing this product, and that product is education or knowledge, be it directly as published research and technology, or indirectly through the students that leave universities and the knowledge that they have. And if that product is a blueprint for new, better fossil fuel extractive technology, or arms infrastructure, or business as usual economists, then it's contributing to the climate crisis, and maybe even as much, if not more, as the companies that end up producing that technology. So we wanted to argue that the ways in which the university produces and how it produces, the ways in which what that product that the university produces and how it produces it contribute to the climate crisis as a union issue. And that's for a number of reasons, which I'm sure that people will also be familiar with by now, but that's that climate breakdown will profoundly affect university workers through physically affecting working conditions, so like heat stress, floods, etc., and through economic and social instability. That the green transition will profoundly affect university workers, as it will reprioritise research aims and teaching goals and the skill sets of on-site and off-site workers, and that could lead to job cuts if it's not a just worker-led transition. And that the terms of current employment fundamentally affect university workers' ability to work for a just transition. And that's because insecure contracts and unmanageable workloads prevent us from being able to live and work sustainably. For example, longer commutes, lack of investment in the institution, etc. So we submitted this Green New Deal claim to the university, and over a two-year period, we went through a negotiation/meeting process with senior management over the things that we proposed. And I think that it was quite a powerful piece of work for a few reasons. It was submitted by the joint unions on campus, so signed off by UCU, Unison, Unite, and the Guild of Students, and we had a full mandate for it at every stage from all of our members. And it kind of used the structure of the university's own commitments. So, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, something that our university signed on to, and we kind of structured it around that, which meant that we were kind of able to push them at their own commitments. And the, albeit very small team of people who worked on it, had really varied skill sets, and that meant that we were able to leverage them quite effectively to make good arguments when it came to kind of that negotiation process. So, for example, you've got people who, understand labour law, but also a physicist who can kind of take all the numbers that they've put out and make graphs that show they're not going to hit their targets, or that kind of thing. It's very useful having those kind of that diverse skill set. And we did kind of have a few small wins from those negotiations. We managed to get them to make some changes to their carbon accounting process to include things like home working and student travel and kind of these like big scope 3 emissions that weren't previously being accounted for. We managed to get them to acknowledge at least the connections between employment and sustainability, and kind of secured a standing terms of preference for continuing to meet us indefinitely to discuss sustainability 3 times a year from now. And I think that there were other changes actually that happened that we'll obviously never be credited with, because that's how union negotiations often play out. But for a lot of it, it did feel like we were really fighting uphill, and could just kind of be smarmed off a lot of the time because we didn't really have teeth. And I think, exactly as Joe said, the language of kind of net zero and just transition has been really corporatized, and our management at the university are perfectly able to kind of show all the ways in which they're working towards these very specific numeric targets and promoting agendas that don't actually include profound change for workers or actually for the environment. And I think that the support of students and members can be a really effective bargaining tool for making these kind of visible and sometimes more aesthetic changes. But without having the threat of actual mobilisation, you're just much easier to ignore. And whilst we had the support of our union very explicitly, the number of people who were actually available and willing to put time into that project was often quite low. And yeah, I think that kind of, I guess, taking industrial action for a just transition to secure climate safe futures seems to me like an imperative. I don't think we were kind of close to that in this situation, to having the ability to do that, but I don't think it's a million miles away either. And I think we're seeing across our industries in the UK how the language of decarbonisation and the kind of official imperative of net zero can be leveraged against us to gut our industries that we actually need to build technologies of a greener future, whilst the companies that continue to kind of profit from the fossil economy just simply offshore their carbon costs. And I think the same thing is true of universities and education, in the sense that like that research, that understanding of climate change is essential. It needs to be open source and accessible, and it needs to be determined by the people who are going to build that future. Industrial action for climate action and a just transition should fight on the both fronts, for climate and employment justice. And I think that those should and can be synonymous. but it's very difficult to know what that action actually looks like at the moment. I don't know if people are following the current situations for university at the moment, but they're having a bit of a mare. And at Liverpool, people are facing major cutbacks and redundancies. They're about to take industrial action, potentially, over kind of hybrid working arrangements and some of the proposed changes that are happening. So I'm not sure what the next step really is for universities in terms of progressing a just transition and carbon neutrality. But I think that, as with all our industries, while we're constantly responding to problems rather than proposing solutions, like we've seen with some of the more advanced transition plans that have been happening in some areas of manufacture that I think people have already heard about and talked about in these series, or some of the kind of more galvanizing actions like the GKN factory that's been occupied by workers for multiple years in Florence. We're always going to be on the back foot, and I think that yeah, my union currently balloting to strike over, amongst other things, this hybrid working arrangements. To be precise, the kind of percentage of time that people spend at work, and that's really important because it affects the day-to-day fabric of people's lives. But it also feels a lot like scrapping for very, very small things in a very big picture of problems, especially where actually this is a problem that feels very mappable onto climate issues when you're thinking about transport and people's presence in the workplace and what kind of space we need. And I don't think that we've seen a totally successful vision of it yet, but I do think that this method of trying to affect the changes we need socially and environmentally, using these kind of full-scale industrial and economic plans, if people are willing to put industrial action behind them, or even more direct action, is something that we should still try and pursue. I think I think the Green New Deal framework at Liverpool was trying to do that to an extent, but without fully managing to encompass the kind of more micro, I guess, needs of all of our employees in a way that actually stitched those problems properly together so that people would feel, so that the whole union would be empowered to be behind that action. And I think without therefore garnering the energy that it actually needs to succeed. But I still am hopeful about that approach more generally. And I'm going to stop there.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Eve.
Hi.
Hi, Lydia. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, no, thanks very, very much, Eve, and thank you for Joe and Daphne as well. I think it's really interesting and quite different talks from each of you. I think there's definitely a lot to. I definitely made notes. I'm sure others have questions and thoughts that sprung to their mind as we had our speakers. It's quite a long session without a break, so it's 2 minutes to 1 at the moment. So why don't we have 5 minutes and then come back at about just before 5 past with a fresh coffee and rested eyes, and then we'll get into the discussion. I've got a couple of questions to open with, and then which I'm going to use my prerogative of having set this up to ask first, and then we'll get into a more general chat with everyone. So I'll see you all in about 6 minutes. Yeah, so firstly, thank you again to our 3 speakers. That was really useful information and really interesting to hear your own perspectives. There are some, or there's at least one question in the chat as well. But I thought to kick us off for the next period of time, and I do want this to be, or as far as we can, to be a sort of open debate. So if I'm going to ask the speakers, and potentially others will ask the speakers questions as well. But if people want to chip in with their own thoughts or answers, then that's fine. This is an open forum, trying to get a broader sense of what people are thinking about these issues and how we can make our organising more effective. So it's not that these 3 speakers have a monopoly on the right answers here. So I was thinking that there's this debate in decarbonisation, in sustainability, about the best approach to actually result in action. Is it about making incentives or pushing schemes or whatever that allow individuals to make space for individuals to make change voluntarily and therefore decarbonize? Is it about changing the systems or cultures around certain actions and putting making a point to change those systems and cultures to make space that people could only make the right decisions, or it's a lot easier to make right decisions or more beneficial decisions? Or is it about accessing power to impose the right decision from above? So is it kind of this is on individuals to decarbonize? Is it on changing the framework so that it's easier for individuals to and corporations and others to take the right action? Or is it about telling people what to do from the top down? And this is obviously a live debate in decarbonisation, and the most effective way to create sustainable organisations or communities or whatever. But it also speaks to not only the kind of actual amount of carbon being emitted and the most effective way to reduce that, but broader, like ecological issues or social justice issues. What is the most effective way to get people to do the right thing in a broad sustainability sense? So I just wondered if we had any thoughts on that rambling thought rather than question. Should we go to each of you or if you'd like to answer that, maybe you can. Joe, do you have any thoughts on that? It's okay if not.
Yeah, it's a very big question. I think I've always struggled with that sort of balance. I think with some of the focus of things on kind of individual behaviour change, and and how difficult that is in the kind of structures we have. And I think it's also something that kind of can create a lot of cynicism when there's too much emphasis on individual behaviour change. So yeah, I suppose I think it is I've definitely seen the importance of having that cultural and structural stuff in place that enables people to make changes they often want to make, but are just unable to. Like if you look at the issue of kind of green transport, that's something we've discussed in our green network a number of times. And just, there are a lot of people that would much rather be using greener transport options, but it's having that structure in place, isn't it? And so yeah, sorry, that was probably quite a simplistic answer to your question. And I haven't really addressed the third part at all. But just off the top of my head, I think, those are my thoughts. Others, please bring in others.
Thanks, that's useful to have. Let's go to Daphne.
So I think we need to consider our context and the space that we operate in. I'm going to give an answer. I'm going to just ask you to bear with me on this one. If there's the ability to operate freely in a particular space, then maybe explore the limits of that. How far can you push those boundaries? If the edges of that space are actually flexible, then ask how you can extend them and in what way. There's a nice conceptual model that I think can be helpful to use in answering a question that's as complex as this, and it's called the power cube. So you all know the good old Rubik's cube, right? There's a conceptual model that was devised by Professor John Graventa at the University of Sussex. It resembles the Rubik's cube, and it's designed to help us think about power in our workplace and our branch, our trade union. It's a way to think of different forms of power. This could be visible, hidden, or invisible. This could be your types of space. So if you think of the different sides of the cube, right, the different dimensions, types of space, which could be closed spaces or invited spaces or spaces that have been claimed already. And then the different levels of power. So your local power, national power, or even global. So if you think about, I'm going to put a link to this in the chat because I know this sounds a little bit airy-fairy, but it actually makes sense when you look at the visuals that they put on the website. Many workplaces operate at different levels, right? And they have different forms of power and they have different types of spaces. But so do trade unions. In some workplaces, decisions might be made by the convener without reference to members. Sometimes a manager might be allowed to do something, but another one doesn't allow something to happen because they want to hold on to their power. So decisions in workplaces may be subject to negotiation, or they might be imposed unilaterally by management. So what we need to ask here is who makes those decisions, and where are these decisions made? And that's maybe where the space for the trade union environment rep comes in. If you think about local and national spaces, these are perhaps easier to grasp. So what type of branch are you in? Are they geographical, national? Do they cover the whole country? Where do members share an employer within a specific industry or sector of the economy? And where can they exercise that power? So that might be called visible power. And if you think about minutes of meetings and what they say about decisions of a committee, that's visible. But if those minutes are not shared, it's not visible. So again, if you look at motions that are carried, they also show who has power within an organization, and who you've got to ask who's missing out, who's not represented. Do decision makers do what they can to really represent everybody? Or do they represent people in their own image? And do they welcome diversity or give room to address environmental issues? So I thought of the power cube in relation to this question, because although it's far from perfect, it doesn't cover every situation, but it is a means to thinking of these different spaces, these different types of power, these different levels of evaluating these forms of power and the spaces and how power operates in an organization. So I'm going to put the link in the chat, and hopefully that makes more sense than I did.
No, that's a very good answer. Thank you very much. And that's great. Thank you. I'd not heard of the power cube, so we'll check it out. I think it's useful to think about these different dimensions, and maybe you've sort of turned my question, albeit it was a rambling question, on its head, and sort of maybe that's a better way of asking my question in the first place. We'll go to Eve.
Not sure how to answer. I don't, when the way that they were framed, individuals, systems and cultures, power from above, I don't really like any of them, but I think because I think I guess the idea that it's using, or the idea that accessing power necessarily leads to or it then uses the mechanism of top-down imposition doesn't necessarily feel like an inevitability or the only mechanism by which to, I guess, use power if it's collective power, which comes from individuals in a sense, but I don't think is asking for specific individual-based change. But I think the things that came into my head particularly, actually, which are not necessarily things I would normally focus on, were they're all obviously very interrelated, and I think that legislation is maybe an interesting place where those things interrelate and you can think about how they're connected. I think that we see a lot of examples of emphasis being put on individual behaviour where clearly there are legislative gaps or things that could be done very specifically and not even necessarily that difficultly to progress environmental change. For example, simple things like kind of consumer end products versus actually having regulations on what's produced in the first place. We talk about trying to reduce things like plastic waste, but don't regulate the people who are producing plastic, who are obviously oil profiteers, and that has to be legislative and systemic change. Similarly, I think cultural change is one of the things that I remember the head of impact at the university in our negotiation on research ethics talking about and emphasizing, in the sense of you can't make rules about these things, you have to promote cultural change within the institution so that people don't culturally want to accept money from arms companies or do research into specific unethical fossil fuel practices. And I think that that's clearly, again, a diversion from a systemic / legislative change that needs to happen within the institution and within the university. And where does culture come from? And they're perfectly happy to make those changes when the tide turns against them and other institutions are doing the same, and then they will, for example, with tobacco companies when those things were banned, and when universities stopped accepting research funding in those capacities. So So sorry, it's not a particularly good answer, but I think it's a false friend, a false question in the sense that they're obviously deeply interwoven into each other. But I am definitely sometimes pro a bit of legislation.
Thanks, Eve. Yeah, no, you're right that they didn't really make space for a sort of social power dynamic there, did it? I guess it was more about how power is used after it's been created, and you're right that it maybe doesn't take account trade union power as an option, where it is mass mobilization that then forces change. I'll go back. I'll rephrase the question, and we'll do this all again at a different time. I've got some other thoughts, but I wondered. Let's open this up. Joe's asked a question in the chat, which I think Daphne's already answered. Did anyone else have any thoughts or questions or comments? It actually doesn't need to be a question. It can just be your own feeling on this.
I don't think I fully answered one of Joe's questions, so I'll jump in here if that's okay, Sam.
Yeah, sure.
Joe, I think in terms of sort of where do we signpost new environmental or green reps to knowledge, and how do we help them understand their role and so on? I think there's space here for what each of us knows to contribute to. So if you think about the networks that Sam runs, the different ways that environment reps can get together, such as a seminar like this, we need to all input into that, because there doesn't seem to be always one specific place for where a new rep can get all of the necessary information. That space feels very big, and yet it's not always very full, but it probably needs to be fuller. I think the trick is to link with other environment reps, find out what they've done, talk to people. Sam was one of the first people I spoke to kind of understand the wider context. And then I identified some courses, the funded ones, because there are lots of different ones that you can find online, and you can join networks, start asking questions. That's how I built my knowledge, and I feel like I'm still a newbie, even though I've done this for a little while. I think you've got to link with others and find out what they did, and if they also don't know what to do, then join together and you're a stronger force. I don't know if that answers your question fully, but that's been my sort of journey. Thanks.
Let's go to the hands. Let's go to Vanessa, and then we'll do Lydia after this.
Yeah, hi. My question, I might think of a couple others, but just to start with, I thought I'd ask. I work in local government, so maybe it's more directed at you, Daphne, at the moment. But yeah, I was just interested in. It was really interesting to hear about the engagement you've done and everything. And actually, good point about Earth Day that's coming up. So I might try and get something in the diary for that. But I just wondered, like, what? Sorry, I missed the very start of the talk, so I might have missed some of it, what you were saying, but. What would you say the main kind of influences you've been able to have on council policy and programmes are off the back of, beyond obviously actually engaging other staff, I suppose? Have they actually taken stock of some of the things that yourselves are proposing, and has that changed things, would you say, notably at all? Yeah, that's just my question, I suppose.
I'll be quite honest, we haven't changed policy yet because we're really starting out on this journey. What we have done, though, is we've made a noise. We've been noticed. We've actually led on things that nobody else was leading on. And I think that was really important, because while policy is policy and it's set at a high level, and it might be influenced through lots of different routes, once that policy is adopted, it's quite hard to change in the public sector. Or it can be. But that's not to say that it's never changeable. By us as environment reps grouping together, working on programs that are very visible, we make a lot of noise, we talk to people, we branded all of our activities as led by the Unite Environment Reps, so that we get that message into people's heads. It's clear that the union is leading on this, but we also make it clear that we work in partnership with officers so that nobody fears us. They don't fear working with union reps, because some managers do. I don't know why they'd be afraid of a union rep. Maybe they've been naughty and they've done something bad and they've encountered a rep who's won against them. I don't know. But others just don't have the experience of working with the union. They don't understand the whole culture of it and the philosophy and so on. So part of what we do is to show people that actually we're very nice people, we're very proactive, we do things that we feel are the right things to do. And that's been a game changer, is to do it branded by the union, but do it openly and make sure that everybody feels involved, no matter which union they're in, no matter whether they're in a union or not. We make sure that brand is there, and that brings people on board because we've made it positive and open. So I don't know if that helps answer some of what you're after.
Thanks, yeah, no, that's good. Thank you for explaining that a bit more.
Even Joe, you both sort of touched on this a little bit in your own contributions about the impact that you feel like you've had. Do you want to come back on this again, or you feel like you said it? That's fine. Lydia's got a hand up. We'll go to Lydia.
I'm sorry I missed the question. I've been guessing what the question was, and I know it's about power. And if I'd been here a little bit earlier, I could have told you a little bit about the work I'm doing across the Northwest to bring the education unions together. And yesterday, I think we got it together so that we've now got a conference coming up on the 14th of June, which is going to be led by the NEU and in collaboration with UCU. And Unison will be there, despite the fact it's their major conference period, so they can't actually help run it. But it's about finding common cause, and the common cause is how do we enable a green workforce, starting from kids aged 8 and thinking about their parents as the current workforce and them as the future workforce, and how do we that's the kind of binding focus that we've all got in NEU and UCU. So it depends on trust, as well. I've worked with the Trades Council for a long time and done things for them. And the ex-chair of the Trades Council is keen to do something visible about environmental education. He's an NEU person. So it's about building on the trust that I have with him individually to enable him to go to the Mechanics Institute and book it, because he's got credibility there. And for me to say, I've got this role in the northwest of England as a UCU environmental officer. But also I'm based in the University of Manchester, and all those things that have got a bit of clout to them. It's not just some random old lady decided she's going to have a conference. And it is about finding the right people to bring together in the room, and literally having them in the room yesterday made a huge difference. So for me, the Green Rep support is about starting where people are already, which isn't very far. A lot of very beleaguered we've only got one Green Rep in the whole of the University of Manchester. That's daft, but it's how it has been. And what we really need is teams of Green Reps in every faculty, every department. But you have to kind of work on how to do that together by not undermining the power of the existing Green Rep, who's an up-and-coming, bright young academic and is doing as well as he can, given the resistance of the university to things like travel plans in Manchester, and decarbonising travel plans, that is. And given that you've got some gender dynamics going on, some age dynamics going on, you just have to be aware of them. But I think 3 unions working together on something with people who've all got some credibility, 2 of whom are very, very good at training and have been training green reps and say, we haven't done enough, and me, who's been talking about it and doing as good as I can for a long time and having experience of group work, I suppose, is a good way of going on. And it's about reaching beyond yourself, but consolidating at the same time. So you're looking for allies. And I think that would be helpful, Vanessa, if you look for your allies. And they're not necessarily in your same union or even in the same building, but you can track them down. So it's a question of surrounding yourself by allies, and then not using them, but bringing them with you and asking their advice. So I never tell anybody anything, I ask them. And I do think that's a good way of going on, because I'm not, the fountain of all wisdom, and I haven't got a budget. NEU has got a budget, and NEU is going to fund it. So, that's what's not to like about that. But they also do feel that they would like to work with Unison, which is much better organised than us, because they've got a much more comprehensive structure that they use. Sam will be able to tell us a bit more about that, but it works very well, and it's to do with having a branch climate, what do they call it, environmental officer, and then green reps working in teams with that officer, and then somebody like Jason Hunter, who's the regional Unison person, bringing them together at regular intervals to find out how they've got on. And when you ask somebody, how did you get on, it's wonderful, because people can say, well, I tried my best, but it didn't work very well. But somebody else can say, well, I had a go at doing it like this, because we're all at different stages as green reps. And some things work in some circumstances, in some power structures, and other things don't. And you're in a constant state of attack, particularly now under, with the attack by the Daily Mail on anything green and anything to do with net zero. So, we've got a new political context in which to regroup, I think. And that helps, ironically, because people are saying, oh my God, the far right is on the attack. And they're skeptics, climate skeptics, and they're trying to undermine what we're trying to do. So we need to be a bit more forceful and positive and get on with it. So I think that's really all I wanted to say, is just work together and do it actually in the room.
Thanks, Lydia. That's really valuable. Does anyone want to respond to anything there that was said? Joe?
Hi everyone, sorry, I've made it off the bus. We just leave the meeting on the phone. Just want to really add to what Lydia was saying in relation to the research that we do. So I'm a green rep at the University of Leeds, and hence my question about resources for our new reps. So thanks for any thoughts on that. But just in terms of Lydia's point, I was doing some research with some workers in a clean power business the other day, talking about their transition from working in coal fire. And I have to say, I was really shocked at the level of resistance to net zero policy, in a sense. Not all of them by any means, but it was very sobering. I guess I kind of assumed that if people were working in that sector, that they were aware that they were contributing to net zero and why it was important and so on. And we asked a question about what they felt about climate change, and there was an overwhelming Daily Mail talking point, which is, well, we only produce 0.1% of the world's emissions. Why are we bothering with regulation to shut down these industries when China's, pumping out blah, 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 blah. Now, I'm not saying that isn't an interesting question, and we were able to reply in a little way we could, because we were doing some research. We were there to listen to people, not to lecture them. But it was very sobering. And I think our reflection of that was, how do we as unions, or how, bringing that back into my union role, continue to develop accessible, not preachy, but practical resources, not just for our own reps, but they may, you know, clearly that may be for a wider rep network, as well as thinking about what environment reps need, to enable them to have those climate conversations. And I know that there's huge amounts of really good resources out there. I'm just not quite sure where they are. So anything we can do to share on that, that would be amazing.
Thanks, Jo.
Particularly a definition of net zero that doesn't get everybody spiky and bad-tempered.
So yeah, I mean that's a big debate. Jo's got a hand up. We'll get her.
Oh, thanks, Sam. It just what Lydia and Jo have been saying, it just reminded me. I don't know if others had seen, you know, the More in Common Foundation, the Jo Cox Foundation, a report they published a few weeks back. I'll post a link to it in a minute. And it was really interesting because it was talking a bit about the rise of kind of populism and far right, and how you kind of talk to people about those things, you know, without kind of having, well, you know, what could be quite difficult conversations, and the kind of the backlash stuff that's happening. And there was quite a lot of interesting stuff there on environment, and that picked up on the kind of terminology on net zero, and found that if you talk about balancing carbon emissions, like a lot more people are on board with that than the term net zero, and other things. It talked about some successful techniques other environmental campaigns have used in kind of activate. They kind of categorize people into these different groups, but how, if you know, if you talk in terms of kind of conservation and stuff, you can engage kind of more people to come along with your campaign. So I'll share that, because there were just some quite interesting points in there that I thought, oh, I hadn't thought of that in that way. And actually, I could see some of the terminology and things I've used sometimes are perhaps, you know, they're good for the kind of activist base, but maybe not so good at kind of bringing in other people outside of that bubble and things. And that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think you're entirely right that how we approach this, and that's been discussed by others before, how we approach this and how we label it is really important. And we can be very effective at talking to those we're already talking to and engaging those we're already talking to, or particular niches, but to kind of maybe broaden this out and kind of get more mass movement, we do need to find more effective ways of thinking about this and framing the issues. There, for the sake of the recording, where it doesn't show what's in the chat, there's been a few resources posted in there, which I will circulate to those on the email list. But we've got some bits from TUC Cymru, and we've got a name drop of the Working with Climate Justice booklet by Ben Crawford and David White, which is a foundational text in many ways, and it's really useful. And I'll share that More in Common thing as well that Jo was talking about. Eve, we'll go to you.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, and I mean, I know it's probably just quite obvious and repeated, but I feel like linking issues to the issues that people are facing in their lives feels like the most effective way to talk about climate change. And I don't think, I guess, like the frame, it's really, I feel like there's a lot of tension between the kind of framing of like, we need people to be and feel informed and able to have difficult conversations, and the kind of, we need to educate people about climate change, which is a really, I find quite a, like, it's not a framing that I feel that comfortable with, because I think that if we're I guess, like, again, if we're thinking about kind of the exploitation of people and the environment as often a synonymous and thing that's happening in parallel, then people, the fabric of people's lives would be improved by similar things and similar policies that would, and changes that will also improve the ecosystem, that will improve the ecology of our society. And I think that trying to, like, of course, net zero is not an effective or appealing strategy, right? I mean, it's not effective or appealing to people who don't care or think about climate change. It's not effective or appealing to people who really care and think about climate change either, because it's a dud solution, and it doesn't capture the kind of root of the problem, really, in my opinion. So I feel like if we're talking to people about net zero, and that's the thing we're trying to sell, then that's I don't think that's going to happen. I think if we're talking about the food and the energy crises, and the fact that people can't afford to heat their homes, and the fact that those things are created and accelerated by climate change, but climate change as a mechanism that comes from extraction and the problems that are being created by the kind of abuse of people and the environment, not as something that exists as like this overarching thing that is somehow kind of separate to those mechanisms. So I don't know. I feel like I don't think that people need to be super au fait with the ins and outs and specifics of climate change and emissions technology and balances to be ecological and community effective activists within their community and their environment necessarily. I don't know if that's I'll stop there.
Thanks, Eve. That's a helpful perspective to have. I had a question, which is maybe which sort of touches a little bit on what we've already been discussing, but we've talked a little bit about those who getting through to those who just don't think it's a problem or don't think they're kind of this, and we've already touched on the far right thing of I guess open denial almost, but there's that middle ground of that you do hear from the far right, but you also hear from managers when trying to talk about this in a workplace context, which is almost the kind of counter agitation argument, not agitating in a different direction, but just trying to negate the work of the union or negate the idea that this is a trade union or a working class issue or a social issue. And it says something like, don't worry about it, we've got it covered. Yeah, this is a problem, it's a tough one, but we've already got it. We've got it covered. We've got a policy on it, and our experts are on this. So yeah, no need to get the whole union involved. We're just trust us. We're getting on with it. I wonder if that's an interesting discussion, or if anyone has any thoughts on what we do about that, because that is something that I definitely encounter a lot. Speaking to trade unionists who earnestly have gone to their management and said, look, we've tried to do this, and they say, well, they've got it covered, and so I don't know what to do, and our employer is already quite good on this, so what do I do? I wonder if we have that discussion. Lydia's got her hand up, so we'll go to her first.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about that, but I think it certainly happens in the University of Manchester, because the guy in charge of social responsibility is the guy who responds to us, and he always says things like that. Particularly around divestment, because we had a very successful campaign with the students to get divestment from fossil fuels. But then nothing happens. You're not at all sure that they're actually carrying it through, and you want to see. So as far as we're concerned, what we try and do is get as many people from different unions, including in the University of the Students' Union, to go with us to see him, so that it's so he can't just blather on with a load of greenwash. Smiling benignly at you as if you're some kind of child. And it's I think it is about asking for the detail, and it is about saying, well, that's very interesting research. I'd like to see how far I'd really like to be part of that operation, and could you send me the detailed link to that? You've got to follow it through. You're not just go home and eat your sandwiches. It's a challenge, I think, when people say things like that. So if we could practice how we deal with that, it would be useful. I think if we had some role play opportunities, how do you deal with that? It really is important, because it happens all the time. And it's going to happen with head teachers in schools. They'll be saying things like, but we got a litter pick, that's what they say usually. Or, we've just done our climate action plan. What do you need? And you look at it and you think, what the hell is that? It's got nothing in it. And but they've done it. They put 10 minutes of their time into it, so they filled in a form. And actually, you have to then say, well, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. I wonder if we could do a bit more work on that with year 5 or whatever it is you've got, enthusiastic young people that you can bring in to back you up. So I do think it's about being, I don't know about being ameliorative in a trade union, but you have to actually find out what's happening to them. They might have just lost their mum, they're too busy, it's shocking what's going on in workplaces at the moment everywhere. So I think offering to do a little bit more for them sometimes works. Yeah.
Thanks. Joe?
Yeah, just from another university example, Lydia, we, as an institution, has a very strong climate plan. I mean, it brought it out in a bit of a rush in 2019 as a sort of when the climate strikes were going on, but nevertheless, it was it was broad based, but it very interestingly proved to be an interesting organising opportunity for the 3 main unions on campus, so Unite, Unison and UCU, of course, and working with students, because there are loads of student activist groups. And interestingly, the networking actually grew during the strikes, because we had teach outs and things on these topics, and the students kind of came along, and that enabled us to do a fairly detailed critique whilst doing well, what a wonderful plan you have, but what about X? Some of which were more demands around clearer, faster, more transparent issues around divestment, but others were where they'd clearly just got a complete blind spot in relation to some of the impacts of the projects proposed and the objectives on their own workforce. So, as I think Daphne was saying earlier, even if there is a well thought through corporate plan of from a worker's perspective, and there isn't actually now, so not only do we have this sort of coalition of the unions and the student activists, but they've actually now bedded in as part of the sustainability work a sort of a just transition, what would you call it, committee, I guess, not a negotiating committee in the way that Eve's been working. We've got something slightly different for that through our normal dialogue mechanisms, but it has been useful, because that was exactly their first response, Lydia. It was like, well, we've got this covered. We've put millions of pounds into it. It must be good. But yeah, reminding them they hadn't really thought about the workforce, and both direct and indirect. So obviously some of the wider impacts, both here in Leeds and beyond.
Thank you. Daphne?
So I was just going to pick up on a theme within your question, Sam, but also pick up on something that Lydia mentioned. I like that idea about having some role play practice where we practice answering or responding to those bland statements that people come out with, and do that in a safe space. So if you did that in a workshop like this and practice those responses, try and build up your responses, find out how other people deal with those kind of statements, and then you're ready for when that actually happens in your workplace. I'm quite a fan of role play when I teach trade union courses. I know not everybody likes that, but it allows people to practice something in an environment where they're not being judged and they're not doing it for real, but they're getting ready for when they have to do it for real. It doesn't feel as new and scary. But mostly I wanted to pick up on something about, you mentioned sort of counter agitation, and what do we do when somebody approaches us as an environment rep and says, oh yes, but I read this in the paper, or I read that, or there's this one on TikTok or whatever. I think there's always room for myth busting. And this is something that we've started doing at our workplace around environmental matters, just straightforward calling out the rubbish when people come out with it. There's no easy way to say this. We know some people will have learnt a little bit and then they want to test their understanding, and others have learnt a lot, and there's this mixture of understanding something. People ardently believe what they perceive as the truth to something, even if it's blatantly wrong. And I mean that from a purely factual scientific point of view. So at our events we display posters with QR codes that lead to fact-checked websites and sources that help to debunk some of the stuff that you see in the papers. We created QR codes for each stall under each theme that we ran last time, and so that way each exhibitor had a robust response to any questions that may have challenged the ideas that the stall was presenting. And it gave people also that vocabulary and that language to be able to use to talk about something in a more neutral way, so that they could get they could ask an objective question, they could get an objective answer. And I think myth busting has been quite an effective way of countering some of the nonsense that we see on social media or in the news, where only one side of an issue is portrayed as though that was the only side. And it's been quite a fun game, actually, because it also shows that while people all have that little bit of knowledge and they might feel that it's absolutely right and they will passionately argue for it, there's also the space, the time for thinking about, actually, can we question that, and what is the science behind it? Have we picked up bits from the press and pasted it all together and made this collage of knowledge that we think is right? Is it right? Or is it a point of discussion where we can all learn a little bit from each other and our different perspectives, and how can we come to an agreement that actually this is what the science says, this is what the facts and figures are? I'm very much from that point of view, so I like to ground things in science and still have that more social debate. So that's something that we've focused on quite a lot, is myth busting. Thanks.
Thanks. I think that's important, and I mean that this is a barrier that's often mentioned when we're talking to new green reps or people taking this on. It's too big. Climate change is way too big an issue. Just transition raises too many difficult questions. I feel very vulnerable being out there, being the face of worker-led transition or green reps from my union. I don't know the answers, and so I think these kind of myth busting things, these kind of resources where they're being able to look up the best way of approaching things is often really helpful. My answer to those kind of questions is always don't worry about it. I think a lot of this is, which I know is the same phrase I used previously to criticize it, but what I mean is sometimes this is a science-based, what's the best, most effective way of decarbonizing or whatever. But from our perspective in the unions, it's more often just a justice issue. What feels right? What kind of changes or policies are going to work for the majority or the workers here? And yes, there's a kind of there'll be climate change elements to that, and it'll be about carbon emissions, and you might need to go into the detail of the actual carbon that you're capturing and the the CO2 equivalent of it all and things like this. But also, if what you're proposing cuts carbon but also makes a load of people unemployed, or that kind of stark thing, well then there's a justice element to it, and it feels, you don't need to be an expert on the technology behind it, it feels wrong. So there must be a better solution where the two things aren't mutually exclusive. I'm just kind of that's my reaction to that kind of thing. I think it's a really useful basis for the science, but it can be daunting to not know the facts. But the kind of what feels right is often a really useful thing, guide to action as well. We've got a few minutes left. Are there any other thoughts, questions, comments to take us towards the end? Joe?
Just a quickie. I was typing and my fingers weren't going fast enough. So I'll scrub that. One of our cases, so we're doing this study, just transition, kind of in lots and lots of different countries. And one of the cases in Germany, and I don't know exactly how this has panned out, but it was just a point somebody raised earlier that officers and reps are very busy with other agendas. And of course, we know that to be very true. I totally agree with what you were saying, Eve, that the challenge of addressing climate is not just the technical challenge of reducing carbon emissions. There's a whole set of other related issues in terms of kind of class and distribution and power. But just to come back to competing agendas, in Germany they're talking about the dual transition of technology and climate, and so some of the negotiation, some of the discussion
Joe has frozen for me. I don't know if that's the case for everyone. She has frozen a couple of times before, but it's picked up. So, oh no, you're back. Here we go.
A university would have slightly better internet, wouldn't you? But there you go.
Dual transition.
Yeah, so I'm just, I kind of leave you hanging in terms of what that actually means for us on the ground as reps. But I think it's an interesting one because clearly some of the transition solutions might be those technologies that have another impact on work and employment relations. So yeah, just say watch this space and we'll try and feed some of that back. But I think it's an interesting one to try and not think about how we frame it in a way that doesn't get rejected by those that think, oh God, it's just another thing.
That's good. That's great. Thank you. Your research is really interesting. Yes, I'd encourage everyone to check out. If you Google Joe's name, you'll find bits. It's really illuminating to see. In fact, we've done this before in this series, but to understand how other countries and other unions of different societies are approaching this transition issue as well. We are getting towards the end, so I'll wrap up. But just to say thank you for to all of you for attending, and thank you especially to Joe, Daphne and Eve, of course, for your time today and for your excellent insights at the beginning, but also throughout this conversation. I've found this very helpful. I'm sure audience have. That's the audience here now, but also the audience who will watch the recording. We get quite good numbers on the recording as well. It will be available online, yeah. So do share with anyone else who you think might benefit from seeing this, and do check out the TUC's other resources. We've got supporting documentation. There are a few bits in the chat which I'll circulate to everyone signed up as well. I will just end to remind you all that this is the 5th of our Leveraging Green series. We've recorded other workshops, so again, you can have a look at those. We have one more left in the series as planned at the moment, which is rather grandly called The Future of Green Organising. That's at 12, it's slightly shorter, 12 to 1:30 on the 27th of April. And again, I can put details around, but you can sign up online. So just thank you again for coming in and for your brilliant contributions. Hope you all have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.